Hey, welcome. And on behalf of the Salt Lake Chamber, we want to meet you welcome you to the last in our series of Meet the Candidate forums this election season. This particular webinar is entitled Meet the Judges and is intended to help each of you cast more informed votes on those judges that are on your ballot this season. I want to particularly start out by welcoming our panel. And first of all, thank you all for taking the time to be here with us. We have an incredible panel here with us today, starting with our Chief Justice of our Utah Supreme Court, Matthew Durrant, David Jordan, who is a shareholder of Stoel, Rives, and a member of the Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission, Rick Hoffman, who is a shareholder at Lone Peak Valuation Group, a member of the Utah State Bar Commission, and also a commissioner on the Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission, and Jennifer Yim, who is the executive director of the Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission for the state of Utah. As we begin today, I want to ask a couple of questions of our group, but I wanted to start out by saying, I always know when ballots are out, because the first thing that happens is I start getting calls from my friends and my family and my colleagues asking me how they should vote on judges and who they should vote for, and how are they supposed to know who to vote for when it comes to judges. The first thing I do is tell them that I'm happy to tell everyone how to vote, and I think everyone should vote exactly as I think they should. But a better way for them to make that decision would be to refer them to the information that comes from the Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission that they prepare and that is public for each of the members of the public to make a decision related to how they're going to vote. And so as we get started in that, I think it's wise for us to step back a little bit, because one of the more common questions that we also get is, why are so many of the judges positively recommended for retention from the commission? Part of the way that we can explain that is if you go back to how judges are appointed to begin with, it explains why so many of them are positively recommended. And so to take that first question, I want to turn the time over to our Chief Justice. And Chief, if you could maybe tell us a little bit about the background of how judges come to become judges to begin with.
I'd be happy to do that, JC. In Utah, we have a merit-based, nonpartisan process. And it is a process as rigorous as any state in the nation for the selection of judges. I've had a chance to compare with other chief justices as I attend conferences, and top to bottom, ours is the most rigorous. It starts off with an application from a would-be judge. That application goes to a committee which has been, which consists of individuals appointed by the governor. He does that in a politically balanced way. He or she, whichever the case may be, appoints both lawyers and non-lawyers to this commission. They review the applications, and they also review the anonymous evaluations that are done of judges. So if I want to apply to be a judge, I need to list attorneys against whom I've had cases, attorneys I've been on the same side with, judges I have appeared before. So it's just a collection of individuals that I've interacted with during my time as an attorney. And they have the chance to evaluate me on an anonymous basis. That is, I will never know how they evaluated me. They evaluate would-be judicial candidates based on the candidate's integrity, based on their work ethic, based on their fair-mindedness. They evaluate judges based on their intellectual capacity. It's a 1 to 8 scale. The commission then collects all of these grading forms from these attorneys, these judicial applicants. And based on those, the commission meets and decides which of those individuals to interview. So once they do that and conduct the interviews, a statutorily prescribed number of individuals, depending on the court level, is sent to the governor. It might be 8, it might be 5. The governor must select from that list. So, and the governor must do so on a nonpartisan basis. That's constitutionally required. So the net effect of this is that if an attorney has not developed a reputation for integrity, if he or she has not developed a reputation for hard work, if an individual has not developed a reputation for intellectual capacity, that individual will not be included in the list to be sent to the governor and will not become a judge. So I think, as JC described, it's a system designed to ensure that we get really, that we're choosing from among the best and the brightest of our legal profession. So at every stage of that process, the focus is required to be on merit. I can tell you that the governors I've worked with have taken this job very seriously. I think that's especially true when JC was running the selection process. She especially was always so careful, so focused on merit, so determined to ensure that the citizens of Utah got the very best judges. So that's how we do it in Utah. And you might think that that's common. There are other states that do it that way. Many states do not. And we'll talk about this more later on, but many states have competitive elections, sometimes partisan elections. So if I want to be Chief Justice in Wisconsin or Texas, it might cost me $5, $6, up to $8 million to run for that office. And where does that money come from? It comes from large corporations who might be appearing before me. It would come from large law firms that might be appearing before me. And it would certainly tempt me to make decisions with my finger to the wind based on political sentiment. Our system helps protect judges from that. It allows judges to make independent decisions, not based on what is popular, but based on what the Constitution requires. So at the front door, we're getting a lot of good people appointed to be judges because of governors who care about it, commission members who care about it, and individuals like JC who assist governors in that process. That's not to say judges can't develop problems. That's not to say that, life happens, as they say. That's why it's so critical that there be accountability, and our Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission provides that accountability.
Thank you, Chief. You mentioned some of the processes that are used in other states, but I think many of us hear about in the news or where you hear about issues with judges. David, maybe if I could turn it to you to just ask, how would you compare our system with other systems? What do you see as the benefits or if there are any downsides to that?
Thanks, JC. There are several other systems in the country. Probably the most notable is the federal system. And I think people generally understand that federal judges receive a lifetime appointment. They don't stand for retention elections. They're not selected in partisan elections, and they're not appointed by anyone other than the President of the United States and confirmed by the United States Senate. And then they serve for life. And the idea behind that life tenure is to insulate judges in the federal system from the political process. And it does have that effect. But of course, it eliminates accountability. The other extreme, as Justice Durrant just mentioned, are elected judges, including judges elected in partisan races. I had a case once in Nevada between the two Las Vegas daily newspapers. And the case was pending before a judge who was up for his re-election race. And he just did not want to make any decisions in the case because he was afraid he'd be accused of bias, or he was afraid one of the newspapers would attack him for whatever decision he made. And so, of course, the downside of having elected judges is that they can have an appearance of partisan bias. It's especially difficult because they have to raise money to run a political campaign, and they typically raise money from the lawyers. And so people wonder, did this particular judge decide this particular case in that way because they received a large contribution from the lawyers who were on one side of the case? That's problematic. Utah has steered a middle course where we have both insulation from the political process, but we also have a level of accountability. Our judges stand for retention elections. They're nonpartisan races. They're uncontested races, meaning there's not an opponent on the other side of the ballot. But judges have an opportunity to prove themselves or not prove themselves and be retained or not retained. But terms are of sufficient length, and others can talk about that, that judges feel a certain level of independence, like they're not directly accountable to the political process. So that's the middle course we steer in Utah between lifetime appointments and elected judges.
Thank you, David. Chief, I want to follow up with you a little bit. That process of having a retention election for these judges that were originally appointed, how does that affect their performance or the way they think about their job?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Judges, well, I should explain that there is an intermediate evaluation process that JPEC, the Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission, does. That doesn't go out to the public. It happens midway through a judge's term. That allows a judge to get feedback from lawyers. And that's invaluable to judges. Sometimes it hurts. Sometimes a judge might think it's unfair. Sometimes a judge might think that the lawyer didn't understand why the judge acted as she did. But overall, judges use that to improve as judges. So that's the midterm process. And then when JPEC provides evaluations in connection with an election, one, it's of course important for the voters to have that information. It's just as important for a judge. Judges want to improve. They want to be better judges. And JPEC helps to provide judges with that, with the feedback they need.
Thanks, Chief. In light of that, Jennifer, could I ask you to just explain the retention process? I think people sometimes wonder, why are these ballot or judges' names on my ballot, right? Can you explain that process for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. When a judge gets appointed and by the governor and then confirmed by the Senate, the judge will take the bench. And the Utah Constitution says that a judge needs to stand at the first general election at least 3 years after appointment. That is a first abbreviated term for the judge of about 3 to 4 years. And then every 6 years after that, or 10 years for a justice on the Supreme Court, a judge will be subject to a retention election. JPEC works with those judges from the time they take the bench until the time they retire or resign, doing, as Chief Justice Durrant just said, 2 evaluations for every term of office. One, a confidential midterm designed to give that judge feedback about their performance, as well as notice about strengths and weaknesses so that they can capitalize on those strengths and have the remainder of their term to remediate any problems, to get training and improve before their retention evaluation. And most judges take that midterm very seriously and are able to address the issues that may be identified by JPEG and the people who fill out evaluations about them. That's another reason I think that when we started this session, there was a comment that many judges do very well in evaluations because of the selection process. The second reason is because of this ongoing process, none of which the voters really see. But at JPEG, we really believe that improvement in the judiciary shouldn't wait for retention elections. Judges should get feedback as they're doing their jobs on a daily basis and be able to act on that more quickly than at retention elections. So, there's this long sort of ongoing process of evaluation that helps judges to improve over time. And the retention election is the end of that process, but it's a very important part of that process, a part that gives voters a say in whether a judge should be able to serve another term of office. So JPEG's role is very limited by comparison with the voters. We make recommendations, we provide information to judges, but voters are the ones who decide.
Just a quick follow-up question, and David or Jennifer or any of you may want to ask this, but how is it determined which judges the different voters are voting on? So how are the judges on your ballot determined? I'll throw that to either of you.
Jennifer, you go ahead.
Okay. So who's on your ballot is based on where you live and the judges that serve your community. So the state is divided into 8 judicial districts, and state court judges serve in a judicial district. If you live in that judicial district, you will be given a vote, a say in whether that judge should continue to serve. There are appellate judges, of course. I'm starting in the middle and going to the top. So the state court judges in the middle, and then up at the top, there are the appellate judges, Court of Appeals and the Utah Supreme Court. Those judges are voted on statewide. So if you're a voter in anywhere in the state of Utah, you will find 7 judges on your ballot this year from the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. Okay, so now let's go to the ground level of the judiciary, the justice court judges. So there are lots of rules about justice court judges and how they appear on ballots, but justice court judges are those municipal and county level judges that serve your community. If you've interacted with the judge before, it's most likely a justice court judge. For example, if you ever had to go to court for a traffic ticket, you're most likely seeing a justice court judge in Utah. Those judges are not selected by our governor, but by the cities and counties that convene those courts. But they still serve 6-year terms. And as voters, if you are a part of that community, that county, or that municipality, you will have a say, and that judge will be on your ballot. The last caveat I will say, because this does strike some voters as odd, if a judge is a judge of a very small community, a small city or town, then that judge will be on your ballot at a countywide level. And so that's a separate statute that governs that. But I think I've tried to answer that question, JC.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate that. I want to go to, so we often hear, and I've spent a lot of time talking with the elections office about votes on judges, and there are a certain number of members of the population who just vote no on every judge without knowing anything, or who leave them blank because they don't feel like they have information to vote. Rick, I want to direct this question towards you. You're one of the non-lawyers who gets to sit on these commissions and help work with judges. Why should voters care, and why is it important for them to actually take the time to vote on these particular these contests?
Well, for me, it's the same reasons that it's important to vote on the rest of the election. The voting is the means that we have to express our satisfaction with the system, and particularly with judges. I think that it's hard to see what judges are doing, but it's for people who aren't in court a lot, it's hard to see what they're doing. But we all feel the effects of what they're doing in a big way. They're a huge part of our justice system, and our justice system's getting a lot of scrutiny right now. And so to me, it's important to vote because this is our opportunity to voice our views of whether we're satisfied with that part of the justice system or not.
JC, can I throw in something on that? I'm expressing a personal opinion now, not a view of JPEC, but I think it's a mistake not to vote on judges. And I think it's a mistake to, in a knee-jerk way, just vote no on all the judges on the ballot. I know some people do that, but judges are not like political officials. Some people think, and with good reason, that there ought to be term limits for politicians, that turnover is good in that political world. I don't think the same reasoning applies to judges. It's my experience that judges get better over time as they hear more cases, as they deal with difficult problems. They get better at their job. They develop wisdom that serves them well in their responsibilities as a judge. And so I think unless you have a reason to vote against a judge, my own thought is, unless I believe that a judge is not serving well, I will vote to retain them. And I think in the end, that's how we get a judiciary that's experienced, has been through the retention process and survived it, and prove that they can do an excellent job.
Thank you, David. For those who have those questions about, well, how do I know I don't want to cast a vote that's not informed? Where can they go outside of this webinar to find information on those judges? Where should they look? Jennifer, can I throw that to you first?
Absolutely. So this is the conundrum that in part motivates judicial performance evaluations. Right? We talked in the beginning of this webinar how we have a merit-based selection process. Well, in Utah, we have a merit-based retention process. So we're not looking at partisan affiliation. We're not asking judges to make campaign promises. We're trying to look at, as citizens, the contributions of our judges in terms of their abilities to do their jobs well. But the challenge is, most of us, if we're lucky and we're not a lawyer, most of us are happy to never find ourselves in court and to not have any real reasonable way of finding out information about the judges who serve our communities. These are very influential people that, it's been said, affect our lives in many, many ways. But we have a hard time finding information about them. So JPEC was created to provide that information to voters, to do data-driven analyses of a judge's performance by collecting information from people who appear before judges regularly, by analyzing objective criteria and reporting that information to voters, so that voters have an opportunity to access that information, look up information on their own, make decisions about what matters to them, talk to lawyers in the community like JC and David, get their opinions, and then make up their own minds how to vote. And I think it's really important to note that this process of voting on judges in some ways is no different than any other process of voting on issues on your ballot. Very seldomly do we go to a single piece of information and just trust that single piece of information, whether it's a candidate's website or a friend's advice. We look broadly for information. We try to seek things that we believe we can trust, and then we do our best to cast an informed vote. And the situation here is the same, and we would encourage people to go to judges.utah.gov to get a start on that information of casting an informed vote.
David and Rick, I just want to ask either of you, I'm sure you get calls just like I do. Who should I vote for? How do you instruct people to find information or to determine how they should do that?
You go first, Rick.
Nobody cares about my opinion about that. I don't get those calls, but I liked your answer about that they should vote my way. But generally, I think that I tell people I think we've got a great group of judges, and so I believe what David said earlier, that I believe the judges all warrant support because I think they've all met the minimum standards. They've all, I agree with him on them getting wiser with age. So I personally encourage people to vote yes for the judges because I believe in the process and I believe what's happened. I believe that through our process, they've been vetted very well through the whole process, not just JPEG, but through the selection process that the chief described through the entire process. We've got a great group of judges.
So I'll add that I'll add this, JC. It is true that sometimes a judge goes off the rails for whatever reason. Maybe personal problems in their life, maybe health problems. It could be any number of things. And that will usually show up in the judicial performance evaluation process. If it does, we'll call a judge in, we'll interview that judge, try to understand what the problem was. If they fail to meet a minimum performance standard that's prescribed by the legislature, we always call them in to see if they have an explanation for it. Our process works this way. If someone meets all the performance standards established by the legislature, we presume that they're qualified for retention. If they fail to meet a minimum standard, we presume that they're not qualified for retention, and that presumption would have to be overcome. There would have to be a good explanation for why JPEG would still recommend their recommendation in spite of them not meeting a minimum performance standard. Now, you may say to yourself, wow, when I look at the ballot, it looks like JPEG always votes to retain all the judges. Not true. Something that the public sometimes does not see is the conversation that we have with judges in private, where we talk to them about the fact that they haven't met a minimum standard, and we're not persuaded that they are overcoming the presumption against their retention. In that circumstance, sometimes judges withdraw their name from the ballot and retire. Other times you'll see a split vote on the information packet that you receive either online or now it's just, I guess, always online, isn't it, Jennifer? But if you see a split vote, maybe that's something that you'll want to follow up on. Maybe you have some lawyer friends and you'll ask some more questions. There may be some newspaper reporting on that particular judge that you'll be interested in reading. But you should certainly go to utah.judges.gov, and there you'll find a lot of information about the judge that will inform you, and then you cast your vote the way you want to, regardless of how the vote may have turned out on the Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission.
Thank you. I think when I read comments online or talk with people, that is one of the most common questions that is asked is, how is JPEG useful if they give a positive recommendation to everyone? And they don't give a positive recommendation to everyone, but I think for the reasons that you've talked about, that does seem to be the norm. I'll open this up to any of you. How else would you answer that question to people? We'll talk more in depth about your process, but what would you add to that if someone were to say, how can it be an objective process if everyone was getting a positive recommendation? Chief, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would respond by saying, one, as has been noted, it's not always a positive recommendation, but more importantly, a lot of judges who have encountered problems of the kind that David described will drop out even at the midterm stage. Sometimes it might be in connection with the evaluations in the election year, but a judge doesn't want the embarrassment of a negative recommendation from JPEG. And so it offers them an opportunity to gracefully retire. So it's a very important check on the substandard judging. And in addition to that, as I previously noted, even apart from the fact that it helps to kind of weed out those judges who've encountered problems, it provides important feedback on how judges can do their job better.
Thank you, Chief. Rick, Jennifer, anything that you would want to add to that?
I would only add, we should expect the judges to generally be high performers. There's a very high bar for them to become a judge in the first place, that people are heavily scrutinized to come into the process. And so we should expect that judges are generally going to be people that we want in that position. And then the majority of them do a very good job in that position. And so to me, this is a sign that our system is working, that we're picking good people.
If I could follow up on that, and thank you for that, Greg. It is a position that people have worked their entire professional career in hopes of being able to receive a judicial appointment. They're not people who've just been pulled off the street. If they haven't, over the course of their career, developed a reputation for integrity and hard work, they're going to be weeded out of the process. They will not be a judge. So that's the starting point. And when I talk about, and when David talks about judges who might encounter health problems or emotional problems or other problems that impair their ability to judge, we're talking about a very small group of people. So to me, it is very unfair, given how judges are selected and the rigor of that process, to simply make a blanket decision to vote all the bums out, so to speak. So.
Thanks, Chief. I wanted to add with that, just briefly, as the Chief alluded to, I had the opportunity to work with Governor Herbert for quite some time, and help him and advise him in his selection and appointment of judges. And I can echo that the process that's set out in state statute and in the Constitution is a really unique one that by definition requires the judges to be the most qualified. So no one's name gets to the governor unless they fit that mold. But it's also a unique process in that the governor is prohibited and the Senate is prohibited from considering partisan political considerations, religious considerations, any of those things. They really are focused on merit, which does give us that entry point of someone not becoming a judge unless we know from the very beginning that they're qualified. And as you mentioned, that doesn't mean everyone performs well once they're given that chance. Most do, and we hope they do. And that's what this process is there. Jennifer, I noticed did you have something to add?
I was just going to say that JPEC is an entity that comes into the public realm when there's an election. And it's when public attention is focused on our work and on the work of judges in advance of these retention elections. But what I think most of the time the public doesn't see is that we're working the whole rest of the time, the other 2 years, to do these evaluations for judges and to work with them. As I said earlier, I think it's a mistake to want improvement in our judiciary to wait for retention elections. So working together to hold judges accountable and to push them to come to work every day and be the best judges that they can be, and for them to feel that motivation, is really one of the primary purposes of an evaluation process. The point is, I believe, we shouldn't be trying to throw the bums out. We should be trying to ensure that Utah has the best state judiciary in the nation, and that we should achieve that using as many tools as we have. And performance evaluation is one of those. Doing rigorous, honest, valid evaluations of judges that citizens and judges can trust to accurately represent somebody's performance is absolutely key. So there are some questions that have been asked about how we evaluate the judges in terms of their implicit biases, their blind spots with regards to race. And I would say this, if a judge's evaluation has things in it that we can substantiate about problems, and this is not necessarily uncommon. It might be about race, it might be about gender, it might be about victims, it might be about prosecutorial biases. There are all kinds of different ways that people can be perceived to be unfair. Those things find their way into JPEG's narratives. So if you go online to judges.utah.gov and you click on the judge's name, you can read the narrative that commissioners have worked to write that fairly represents the judge's performance evaluation. So we incorporate that analysis into our evaluation of a judge. And if the judge decides to run for the retention election, you have access to it online.
I wonder if I could.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Just to follow up, you know, we used to do this evaluation of judges internally, and when it was first moved to this independent group, JPEG, there was a lot of natural tension there. Judges were being judged, and maybe it had a bit of a rocky start. But if I could just say this about the present commission, one, we have extraordinary people like David, like Rick, serving on that commission. We have independent-minded people, lawyers and non-lawyers. Two, it's run by Dr. Yim, who in my opinion has done an absolutely extraordinary job. Now, are there still some tensions? Yes. Again, these people are the judges of the judges, but we take great comfort in the fact that they are, to a person, highly qualified, independent-minded, and committed to Utah's judiciary, and committed to helping to improve our judiciary. So, while it's not always easy for judges to be judged, I really appreciate the way this commission invests so much time and so much thought and consideration into fairly judging our judges. So, you know, when people suggest, well, what's the point of the commission? It kind of does rub me the wrong way, because this commission just flat out helps to improve our judiciary.
Let's talk a little bit about the process that the commission goes through. One of the things that if folks go to the website and look at the different evaluations, they'll see some percentages and some different things like that. Let me just ask you this question, and perhaps we can have, Rick, maybe I can turn this to you. Just because a judge gets the recommendation, and people, if you're looking at the ballots, will say that they're recommended for retention or not recommended for retention. If someone's recommended for retention, does that mean that all the judges who have that recommendation have an equal skill level or an equal performance level?
No, it means that they've passed the minimum standards. We see to me, it's a fascinating process. We see, just like you would with any group of humans, different skills spread across them, different strengths and weaknesses. And the criteria that we use includes surveys as well as courtroom observations and a variety of things that we may talk about. But those criteria, it's fascinating to me how often criteria that comes for data that comes from different sources says the same strengths and the same weaknesses about different judges. In other words, several sources all say the same great things. They all see the same great things about a particular judge, or they all observe a particular weakness of a judge, which gives me comfort that, one, the judges, just like any group of humans, have different strengths and weaknesses, but two, that our data sources are seeing what we're trying to observe in this process.
JC, can I add something to that?
Of course.
One of the criteria on which we evaluate judges is procedural fairness. Now, I've been watching the questions that have popped up during the course of this webinar today, and one of the questions was about how do we evaluate judges for bias of various kinds, a racial bias, a gender bias. When we ask the people that we survey, for example, like lawyers, about questions of procedural fairness, we will often see, we'll get a good insight into how the judges are perceived in terms of the way they treat people. Do they treat men and women equally? Do they treat people of all races equally? Do they have a religious bias? Comments will come back from lawyers, sometimes from courtroom observers, sometimes from jurors, sometimes from caseworkers who work in the juvenile court system. And so we do have ways of seeing whether there is bias in the way that a judge is doing their work. Now, part of the question that I saw pop up on my screen is, are judges trained for implicit bias, trained on how they might filter that out of their work? I'll let Justice Durrant speak to that, but let me just tell you something about how JPEC does its work. We do receive extensive bias training, including implicit bias. And one of the ways that we protect ourselves from bias is, as we work through our process, for the first stages of our evaluation process, we don't know the judge's race, we don't know the judge's gender, we don't know anything about the judge except a number and the evaluations that they've received from others. And so we try to filter out our own biases as we work through our process.
Chief, did you want to add anything to that?
Certainly. Yeah, there's not a judge in our system who is intentionally unfair or biased. Each judge is struggling to make the right decision based on the facts and the law. But we are all products of our life experiences. We all have biases, whether implicit or explicit. When explicit, we can directly account for them and ensure that they don't infect our decision-making process. When implicit, we don't have that same opportunity unless we have been trained to recognize our own implicit biases. So for that reason, yes, we do have training. We had an appellate court training, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, for instance. We do it at our conferences. This is something we're very focused on right now. David mentioned the concept of procedural fairness. That's the notion that it's not enough for a judge to just make the right decision. The people who've been in that judge's courtroom should leave having felt heard. So even if someone loses, they're entitled to know why the judge made that decision. They're entitled to say their piece, to feel like they had a meaningful opportunity to express their view. That is a particular concept that I give JPEC a lot of credit for bringing that to the fore in terms of our judiciary's focus on that. Now it has become a very large focus of our judiciary. Just one last note, because we have been concerned about the issue of bias, whether explicit or implicit. We recently decided as a court system through our judicial council the governing body of our court system, to create an Office of Fairness and Accountability. That was a big step, especially in this challenging time fiscally, to devote a portion of our budget to the creation of that office. But I am thrilled about it. Thrilled about the opportunity that gives us to not only even better educate our judges about implicit bias, but also to do more outreach so that communities feel like the courtroom is not so foreboding a place, that it's a place where they can go and get a fair shake. We need to reach out to our disadvantaged communities, our minority communities, to all of our communities, to ensure that they feel like the courts are a place where they can go and receive fair treatment. So that's just one thing one notable thing that we've been doing recently.
Thank you, Chief. I want to shift a little bit from this very important topic, but I want to focus a little bit on the JPEC evaluation. So when folks go and look at the actual evaluations and the recommendations, help us understand everything that goes into that process of putting those evaluations together. Jennifer, maybe we can start with you. What are they made up of?
Okay. The evaluations of judges include surveys. So we do surveys with attorneys, particularly in a judge's court, with court staff, and we construe that very broadly to include judicial assistants, case managers, interpreters, bailiffs, maybe even treatment providers who work in a specialty court with a judge, as well as juvenile justice professionals and others who do frequently find themselves in court and that we're able to reach. So we do those surveys. We also do courtroom observation. We have trained lay observers. We have 50 of them across this state who go to judges' courts. They now go virtually to judges' courts, but observe judges holding court and make observations about this issue of procedural fairness, about how the judge treats people who appear in court, and sends that information to our commission. We collect objective data on a judge's performance, including tracking judicial discipline meted out by the Utah Supreme Court, and other standards like judicial education and time standards, like how quickly they manage cases that they take under advisement. So we look at all of that information. And there are, as was said earlier, statutory minimum performance standards. We report those minimum performance standards and compare the judge to those standards as well as to his or her peers, and put all of that information together into a report. Commissioners vote on whether the judge should be retained. They are constrained in their decision making in ways that David Jordan spoke to in the beginning of this webinar. And then the commissioners vote, the judges get a copy of that report and get to make the decision about whether to stand for the retention election or not. If the judge stands for the retention election, then you get the information at judges.utah.gov.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought we were done for a moment, but I wanted to ask if you could also just follow up a little bit of what went into the determination of what these minimum performance standards are. How did we decide what those benchmarks are for making someone a good judge?
I think that answer has probably lots of different pieces, and I'm going to actually rely on my co-presenters here to sort of fill in the pieces. But I do know that we have used standards that have been created by the American Bar Association, and that we've looked at things that as a commission we believe matter, like procedural fairness, how people are treated in court. And we've developed in the legislature minimum performance standards to set those out either in statute or occasionally in rule. Maybe somebody else has something else to add to that.
One of the performance measures, and you've all mentioned this actually in various answers, is the concept of procedural fairness and how well a judge does at that. Maybe I could ask Chief, if you could talk a little bit more about what is procedural fairness as it comes to rating of judges, and how do judges incorporate that into their work?
Yes, JC, thank you. Procedural fairness is not a Judge Judy. I think the opposite of Judge Judy. Judges are obligated by our code of conduct and by their oath to not just neutrally resolve a dispute, but to treat each individual with respect and dignity. There is no excuse for a judge to ever be rude to anyone who appears in her or his court. And as I mentioned earlier, we have an obligation not only to get the decision right, but to explain it in a way that people feel heard. I'll just say that this is also something that I've appreciated from JPEC over the years. I think in the early years, well, let me just put it this way. I think JPEC itself and the way it judges us, the way it judges the judges, has taken great pains to ensure that we can feel we're treated fairly, that we understand the process, and we understand the criteria that are employed. That's just something everybody should be entitled to, whether they are judges or whether they are individuals appearing before judges.
Thank you, Chief. To say that's a process that, or a concept that I adopted from the judiciary many years ago, or at least I try to, is that concept of procedural fairness or due process, and that any process I think is better understood, or your interactions are better. People understand why you're doing what you're doing. They feel listened to, they feel heard, they feel understood, and they understand the reasons why a decision was reached, whether or not they agree with you. I want to talk just a little bit now in our remaining time about what this process kind of looks like for a judge. And so maybe we can talk about, if we can start, and I know I'm going to the Chief a lot, but when you become a new judge, there's a lot to learn, just like there is in any new job. But what is that learning curve like, and how does this process help judges learn what they're doing or should be doing?
Well, thank you, JC. We have our own internal training process for new judges. It's extensive, and I think that our educators do a fine job in that process. But it is a bit like drinking from a fire hose for anyone, no matter what their background. And especially, let's say, if you are maybe a civil litigator, someone who practices in the area of lawsuits, business disputes, and so forth, suddenly you're asked to decide criminal matters. You may have no experience with that. And the reverse can be true. So that initial training is critical, but you never can quite do enough. Judges learn over time. We have a mentor system. The first time that they are reviewed is usually, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Dr. Yim, but it's usually 2 years from the time the judge began service as a judge. They've learned a lot by then, but there's still a lot to learn. That's why it can be so helpful and sometimes eye-opening to see comments from attorneys that come through the JPEC evaluation process, and to be able to have weaknesses identified that you can start to work on. And when we get those back, also where a judge wants the help, and typically a judge will want the help, we also offer mentoring from senior judges. That can help in the training process as well.
Thank you, Chief. Jennifer, David, Rick, I want to turn this to you, but as you've worked with JPEC, one of the things that people often wonder, lawyers are going to protect the judges, or judges are going to say nice things about one another. It's a very internal process. I want you to talk a little bit about those citizen, and I say citizen, but non-lawyer, non-legally trained evaluators that take part in this process. Who are they? How do they work through things? And how do they get that information to you?
Well, let me follow on to the Chief Justice's comment before maybe we'll kick it to Jennifer to talk about the Courtroom Observer Program. So there's an old saying that when you become a judge, all your jokes become funny. There's a truth behind that, because judges are in a very important position in our society, and lawyers want to have a good relationship with judges. They know they may appear in front of that judge. They want that judge to like them. They hope that will mean that they'll get a good shake in the judge's court. So if lawyers didn't have an anonymous process for registering their opinions about judges, then we might not get candid feedback. But it is an anonymous process. We survey lawyers and others who participate in the process, including the judge's own staff members, including jurors and others. And when we prepare either a midterm report or a full retention election report, we anonymize all those comments in such a way that the judge will not be able to perceive who made the comments. And so I think we do get a level of candor from people that we wouldn't otherwise get. And that's helpful. That's helpful for judges, because just because everyone laughs at your jokes doesn't mean you're funny. And sometimes judges need candid feedback about the ways that they can improve. And I think through our process, we're able to give them that kind of anonymous, candid feedback.
Thank you, David. Go ahead,
Jen, if I might, I think this is, I appreciate this last question that you just asked. And it's because of this. I think we've been spending a lot of time talking tonight about how this process helps judges. And I think that's really important for voters to understand, that this process that they take part in is the last stage of a judge's term of office, when a lot of work has gone into it. And yet, much of our conversation hasn't really been focused on voters and what they get out of this process. And so I want to kind of, let people know that there really are regular people who participate in the evaluation of judges, that their community members who you live next door to are helping to evaluate the judges who appear, who serve our communities, and that there are lots of non-lawyers involved in this process. And I think that's part of what JC's question originally gets to, is that half of the commission are non-lawyers. Many of them don't know a single judge personally in Utah or professionally in Utah. They're retired teachers, they're accountants, they're soccer moms, they are former business leaders or community organization leaders in Utah. And they take this information in, and they need to decide whether the judges who are serving their communities are doing a good enough job. And they are working, hard to provide information to voters so that voters can feel like they have a real way to participate in a process. Having voters make the final determination is key to a merit-based selection and retention process. It gives us voters a real say in their judiciary, in their justice system, and it's an important say. So I guess I would just encourage people to learn about this process, to learn about the judges that are on their ballot, and go to judges.utah.gov to find out that starting point for information for you to do that research to help you cast an informed vote.
Thank you, Jennifer. We are out of time, but I do want to say, and if anyone has any closing remarks, I don't want to preclude them, but I do want to say, I think that one of the very unique things about our system here in Utah is that we are very fortunate. While most voters are unaware of this process, and it is a fairly new process, or don't know how to access that information, if you are looking for it, we actually have more information and more objective information about the judges who are on the ballot than you really do about any other candidate on the ballot. As you think about a traditional election campaign, those are done in the sphere of convincing people based on different kinds of touch points. These are truly objective evaluations that are there if people will take advantage of looking at them. I want to thank our panelists. I know your time is very valuable, and the time that you spend in this process is impressive, and we thank you for that and for lending your expertise. Before I just close, anyone have any closing remarks or anything else you'd like to say? If not,
Great job, JC.
thanks, David. If not, then I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank our panelists for joining us and for their work. Encourage you all to go to judges.utah.gov to find this information. Please share that with your friends and family so that they too can cast those informed votes, and that they're not just calling me so I can tell them who I think that they should vote for. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon.